thank you very much for making time to join us here. We'll just go straight to the session introduction. As you've heard, we're going to talk about non-Arctic states in Arctic governance, and we're going to together navigate the evolving order. So the question is, what is the interaction between the world order changes and Arctic governance? And is the illusion of Arctic exceptionalism over? Of course, we all know Russian invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent events that followed afterwards. So we want to try to understand whether the global order has transitioned from the bipolarity to the post-Cold War unipolarity order. How do we come to terms with this? And with us today, we have two ambassadors, a professor, and another PhD research scholar. So discussing these topics, we'll look at science diplomacy of non-Arctic states, their identities, and their engagements within and outside the Arctic Council. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker today will be Professor Christopher Rossi, who is a professor of political science at the Arctic University of Norway. Chris has also been the director of national security in Clinton White House and is now authoring a book on Arctic geopolitics. So Chris, I will give you the floor.
From non-Arctic perspectives, Arctic avenues of commercial exchange float like an inviting lure atop the world. When contrasted with forestalled efforts to penetrate across the Korean Peninsula into Central Asia, or through the increasingly choppy waters of the South China Sea, a northern sea route presents commercial rewards and bilateral economic opportunities. Arctic ice melt likely will develop along two tracks for non-Arctic powers. For middle powers, including India, Japan, South Korea, the geostrategic circumstance of Russia's proximity to opening Arctic waters, coupled by its historic development of its cabotage system involving the Northern Sea route, requires engagement with Russia. The soft law structure of Arctic governance promotes functional rewards relating to common scientific interests, but remains soft in important respects because circumpolar powers have yet to perfect designs involving ice-covered areas. Moreover, circumpolar powers show little, if any, willingness to expand, unclose, or fundamentally reorder the extant soft law Arctic regime because of uncertainty with regard to the speed and extent of the Anthropocene's creation of Arctic blue waters, not to mention a certain territorial temptation to keep matters closely held within the club of circumpolar powers. As a consequence, one track for Arctic Pacific countries and non-Arctic powers in the Arctic will be to secure bilateral opportunities for resource extraction and trade in conjunction with Russia's Far East Development Plan and exploitation of its Siberian interior. These opportunities will enhance development of the eastern stretches of the Northeast Passage, which, despite enthusiastic portrayals of launching a new transcontinental maritime highway across the top of the world, most likely will merely facilitate the cabotage system that hugs Russia's Eurasian shore. As a parenthetical, talk to mariners who know how to float boats through dangerous passageways and ask them what they think about the commercial utility of opening up the Northern Sea route with its 17 strictures along its passageway. Ask them what they think about the difficulty would be in terms of using that transit system, as Mr. Putin sometimes suggests, might turn into a new Suez Canal. They will disagree with that assumption and probably not risk life and limb to secure Mr. Putin's dream. So, These opportunities with regard to opening up the commercial pathways will enhance the development of eastern stretches of the Northeast Passage, but they won't inure to the dream of opening it up as something more than a cabotage system. So here, non-Arctic powers can benefit from comparative advantages associated with shipbuilding, technology, and access to capital in exchange for energy and resource opportunities while they attempt to expand their Arctic foothold in ways that observer status in the Arctic Council cannot promote. While collective engagement with the apparatuses of the Arctic Council help to legitimate non-Arctic powers' interest in Arctic affairs and provide a method for instantiating more active involvement in Arctic governance, the economic prospect of penetrating Central Asia through the opening of the Northern Sea Route passageway to Siberia presents an anthropogenic opportunity to restart multiple Eurasian initiatives. Developing this relationship balances Asian, Pacific, middle powers and economic interests with security and strategic commitments that emerging China and Russia would seek to weaken, and consequently, that kind of a policy is not without risk. However, Japan and South Korea and China as well have now incorporated Arctic strategies and strategic policies into their national security calculations, which present pathways for international trade expansion that these Asia-Pacific countries intend to promote. A second Arctic track for non-Arctic power participation combines the melting polar ice cap with long-term great power interests. If indeed a transpolar or mid-ocean, that means over the pole, route develops, not only would it be the shorter than the coastal Arctic routes involving the Northern Sea Route and the Northeast Passage, but it would circumvent problems of contested sovereignty and the strictures of navigation that accompany transit along the Eurasian Arctic coast. Circumpolar geography and the extant soft law forum of the Arctic Council once may have suggested that the high north bore characteristics of a closed sea, of a mare clausum, projecting traits more of a gigantic frozen lake rather than a high seas regime. Policy rotations on 3 continents draw anthropogenic attention to this once ice-covered landscape, making it more than before an object of increasing international attention. The globalizing Arctic challenges clubbish state behavior and the region's soft law governance, presenting widening pathways for non-Arctic state involvement and participation in the ever diminishing world of Arctic ice. Thank you.
Now we go to our second speaker, Ambassador Piotr Rychlik, who is Ambassador for Arctic and Antarctic Affairs.
Thank you very much, Larry, and again, it's very nice to meet you all, the distinguished colleagues, and I'm having a very enjoyable time here in India. On one side, meeting my prominent colleagues from Arctic Forum, whom I am meeting quite frequently, and on the other hand, meeting new people, seeing new faces, and thank you for all the conversations we are having on this occasion. Just a few remarks to share, and then in order to leave also a space for discussion. As it's been mentioned today throughout the meeting, we find ourselves in turbulent, challenging times, but it is not the first time we encounter challenges, and it is not the first time during the existence of the Arctic Council when we see some storms on the horizon or even sail through the rough seas. I'm looking at Ambassador Piotr to correct me if I'm wrong, but I guess we've been through some crisis already. I think the simple response to that is that we should take firm stance on our values and try to protect them. And on the other hand, we should appreciate and respect what we have already achieved as a community of nations, because when we use it properly, we benefit from it. I believe it is worth reminding that the international order and legal framework may be very imperfect, but it is still the best one we have, and we have had in the history of the mankind. Only after the Second World War we developed a comprehensive system of cooperation between states based on several crucial principles. We have a Charter of the United Nations, which clearly stipulates, for example, that armed aggression or threat of an armed aggression is forbidden. We have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that set standards in the protection of the most fundamental values. So even if those regulations are violated, most of us know that this is a breach of rules and that perpetrators should be punished. From the legal point of view, knowing what is right and what is wrong is absolutely crucial, and even if some principles seem obvious today, they were not 100 years ago, and we should not lose that. The idea of peaceful cooperation, constructive cooperation within the Arctic Council somehow derives from the positive experience in other areas, and the true belief that major environmental and social challenges can only be addressed by common approach. What I reckon was special and hopefully is still special about the Arctic cooperation is that it can serve as a gateway to lowering tensions in other areas. Why? All Arctic Council members are important actors, both globally and regionally. They have their well-rooted modus vivendi in the Arctic, and they might try to export it to other regions. It is not maybe the case at the moment after Russian aggression on Ukraine, but nevertheless, thanks to the exceptionally competent chairship of Norway and valuable work of the Secretariat, the Arctic Council managed to continue its work, and well, even if activities at political level needed to be limited. So how about the observer states in this complex picture? It should be noted that we are not a homogenic group, but in general we try to maintain good or even friendly relations in Arctic and beyond. Among the observers we have superpowers like India or China that have great capacities in Arctic research. Also, if of the European observers undertake significant projects in the Arctic. And in addition, we take advantage of being members of the European Union, and we use the structures of the Union to scale up our projects. And by the way, the EU is also entitled to observe works of the Arctic Council, not being formally yet the observer. So what could be the main added value from the observers? My belief is that it is our vast scientific competence. This is the highlight of the observers' contribution to the entire Arctic community. We were referring to also Antarctic Treaty meeting that took place last year in Cochin, in Kerala. And so it's worth noting Arctic and the Antarctic are different worlds when it comes to the legal framework. In the north, we do not have like one comprehensive closed legal system like we do in the south where Antarctic Treaty is in place, but nevertheless we should use constructively what we have, and those possibilities coming from binding and non-binding regulations. So first and foremost, Svalbard Treaty, the Ottawa Declaration that established Arctic Council, as well as the Law of the Sea. Yes. Yeah, Larry, you wanted to add something?
No, I'm just saying that you have 2 minutes.
Sure. So I'm just few remarks. So speaking as the Polish representatives, I'd like to commend my colleagues from the Arctic Council for their openness towards the observers, and I'm really grateful also to my colleagues from observer states and organizations for their very constructive and cooperative attitude. So how Poland is present in the north? We try to support the council and its members in all endeavors aimed at preserving natural features of the region, and also when necessary provide some assistance to its inhabitants. Our strategy for the Arctic is embedded in the Council of Ministers resolution from 2020. That was the first like Arctic policy with the state stamp, let's say, on a ministerial level, the first time. As a follow-up, we also established an advisory committee consisting of ministers and scientific institutions, so that all of us know at the same time what we are doing in Arctic research. In scientific sphere, there's a lot of going on. My colleagues from the science sector are engaged in projects concerning cryosphere, sea waste energy, the glacier mass balance, water cycle in the Arctic, and many others. We plan to develop our presence, so we have recently opened a new logistics and research center in Svalbard called Bera, so a female polar bear. And this center is open to our partners from other countries, not only EU partners. Just to conclude and shorten my intervention, to answer the question what we should do as the observers, we should keep going with our policies and projects aimed at preserving Arctic environment. Failure to do so will affect us even if we are geographically distant from the region, and we should invest in multilateral cooperation, try to convince every partner that Arctic vulnerability needs to be protected. How can we convince? First and foremost, through credible scientific results. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Piotr. Go to our next speaker, Ambassador Agostino Pinna, who is Special Envoy for the Arctic and Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, Italy.
So, good afternoon. Thank you again to the organizer, to the Indian Observer Research Foundation and the Iceland Initiative. So my brief speech will be about illusion of Arctic exceptionalism. So I will try to define a little bit this concept which appears in the last 3 decades, let's say. So the notion of Arctic exceptionalism in fact arises within the broader context of the geopolitical transition from the bipolar structure of the Cold War to the unipolar world of the so-called Pax Americana. The Arctic has become a place of cooperation, particularly in the decades following the dissolution of the Soviet Union and period when the emergence of the United States as the unique global superpower. This was in the 90s, in the last centuries. Now the situation is again changing. We see the coming of a more conflictual era with, of course, the principle of inviolability of borders, which has been violated by Russia in Ukraine, and we see also an escalating competition over natural resources and maritime routes, and with major powers involved in the Arctic, and this is leading to, again, to a growing primacy of geopolitics. But the case of Arctic exceptionalism was rooted in argument suggesting of the protection of the Arctic from traditional geopolitical concerns, and the perception of the Arctic as a zone of cooperation. And this was the assumption. This was the approach of the Arctic countries in after the end of the Cold War. So they tried to negotiate a regional order based on a cooperative framework. Then at the time that we can call the time of liberal order, characterized by the establishment of institutions such, of course, the Arctic Council, but of others, the International Arctic Science Committee, the University of the Arctic, regional cooperation framework in the Barents and Bering regions. And this organization focused on liberal topics like, of course, scientific collaboration, environment protection, the right of indigenous peoples, etc. And this was something different than we had during the Cold War, when the cooperation was limited, and the strategic importance of the Arctic was more for nuclear deterrence, for geostrategic interest of the superpower. This was a period of more static period where in the Arctic prevailed a negative peace, meaning an absence of violent conflict, but at the time the region was like a kind of buffer zone between the two superpowers, again in the Cold War. So this let's say situation of negative peace create the condition of area of cooperation when this tension eased, when this tension become less and lower in the 90s, in the early 90s. This was the birth of the illusion of the Arctic exceptionalism, which takes shapes, maybe we can say also one significant moment was the Gorbachev speech in Murmansk in 1987, when he proposed making the Arctic a zone of peace and cooperation, and this was a new vision, and the Arctic was seen as a model of demilitarization, again, protection of the environment, scientific cooperation. And this was a vision shared in general, although not completely by the Arctic, by the Western countries, by the West. This was a time when the Arctic was seen as a model also for other regions, so it's as a way of resolving disputes and between former adversaries, former rivals, was like a perfect model. Now we have seen it starting maybe in the last decades. This is a trend that we have been observing in the last 10 years, that the Arctic is again transforming itself in a zone of latent conflicts, where the economic and strategic issues are again on the rise. We see again geopolitical factors gaining greater importance, and this maybe we have to be honest and to tell the truth that this idea of Arctic exceptionalism since the beginning was a little bit an illusion, so was not completely true. Also in the 90s, on the early 20s of this early 2000, because always the United States rejected a little bit the logic of Arctic exceptionalism, thinking that they did not want to be limited, and they did not want the Arctic Council to address also military security issues, or they prefer a system based on consensus, the decision-making system based on consensus. So this means that the Arctic exceptionalism was also some remain to some extent a dream, was never completely implemented, was so the sort of military confrontation and security issue continue to prevail somehow. And this vision was of Arctic exceptionalism was like a goal, but not completely accomplished. So was a peace zone dream which gained momentum, but was never realized in fully realized. And now, so we see that we have a reality check now. So we see that this kind of illusion we had is under threat still more than it was before. So there is a growing understanding that Arctic exceptionalism remains a goal, but is something which is very difficult to realize. But in spite of that, we have to consider it a target. We have to consider it a goal to pursue, to be pursued in the coming years again, to overcome the present period of turbulence, the present period of conflict. And I'm sure that I'm convinced that certainly for Italy, but also for some other European, for the majority of European Arctic countries, this remains a value that we have to have in our mind, to have as a goal, because the Arctic remains an environment very fragile for the reasons we are listening also during this seminar. So remain a very fragile environment, and for that we have to prevent an excessive competition that can create even more serious, dangerous, irreparable damage than in other parts of the planet. So for that, the dream of Arctic exceptionalism, or the illusion of Arctic exceptionalism, should remain in our agenda for the next decades in order to be an objective of the international community. Thank you.
The only lady on our panel today is Kanagavali Suryanarayanan, who is a PhD research scholar at UIT, and she's also an advocate and a first world law scholar from India.
Thank you very much, Larry, and good evening to everyone. I'll take forward from where Master Agostino finished on Arctic exceptionalism. He gave you a good idea of what it is all about, and Arctic exceptionalism is the normative idea that was promoted Arctic as a unique region which has its own history, geographical conditions, and set of norms that it believed that it's insulated from the global geopolitics. But for decades, this perception held ground, and you know now what's happening, that's not the reality anymore. So Arctic was considered as a zone of peace and driven by scientific cooperation and environmental stewardship. So the larger geopolitical game is also played in the Arctic today. So the challenges, as you all have heard in the morning session, that climate issues, climate monitoring is becoming a problem, and human security concerns, and also scientific cooperation. So since there are a lot of youngsters, I'm not sure if you know the history of the Arctic Council. I thought I'll touch upon that a bit. But for others from the Arctic itself, it would be a known story. So this is the Arctic Council is a nodal body of governance in the Arctic itself. So it was through the signing of the Ottawa Declaration in 1996, the 8 Arctic states and Intergovernmental Forum was built. So the roots of this cooperation can be traced back to Mikhail Gorbachev's Zone of Peace, a call in 1987. From then on, the Finns and the Canadians took over. The Finns established an acute innovation of tried to bring in all the 8 Arctic states together and created the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy. From there, the Canadians also pitched in. We had people not just from the states and the governments, the civil society, the academia, and also the indigenous people pitched in creating what we call as Arctic Council. It's not a treaty body, it's an intergovernmental fora that has been helpful in steering the way that Arctic is governed. So you had people like Fred Roots from IASC and Franklin Griffith from University of Toronto. We had many people from academia who pitched in, and we also had a lot of work that's been done by the indigenous people, especially from the Inuit Circumpolar Council. You had Mary Simon, Rosemary Kaptana, so many more people pitched in. And the indigenous voices are not just at the periphery, it is part of the framework. So it is so important for Arctic to have this even before UNDRIP came into place. So the indigenous voices are truly heard in how the Arctic is governed. So despite early resistance from US and hard security issues were kept out that we had a discussion in the morning. But however, there are certain instances we do have the hard security matters touched up. We, in one of the working groups where it deals with environmental protection, emergency preparedness, you have had Danish naval officers who had been chair of that body, and we have had expert groups on radiation. So these are all not very much into the hard security, touching base on the hard security and how the human security angle and climate issues are always part of what Arctic is made of. So this model survived. The shock of Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, and while Russia was expelled from G8, the Arctic Council still stayed resilient. This resilience was praised as a proof of Arctic exceptionalism, the idea the region was somehow immune to the global great power challenges. But 2022, with Russian invasion of Ukraine, the illusion crumbled, and today we still have somehow managed to get this working group functioning virtually, but you can clearly see the Arctic is no longer exceptional. It is fully enmeshed with the changing global order. And people like us, the academicians and policymakers, always emphasized on cooperation. The military planners, on the other hand, had never let go of the Arctic strategic importance, and also the importance how it is seen as a military theater. I mean, as early as 1935, people have spoken about how Alaska is important, and even in recent conversations in 2020 also, it's seen as the Bering Strait is seen as the next Gibraltar or Strait of Hormuz. So that's the kind of importance that's been given in the military schools. The military doctrines have held this region as a very strategic importance. Even in the NATO, all your Western, the Northern commands and the Indo-Pacific command all align at that point in Alaska. So it's very crucial for them. Be it the Greenland, UK, Iceland gap, or be it how the Thule Air Base is, or which is we call as a Pacific Space Base, where you saw J.D. Vance and Mrs. Vance recently visit. So it's all important. And Ellesmere Island, you have the signals outpost there. And for the Russians, you have the Kola Peninsula and the forward base in Franz Josef Land, where the bombers could be landed. So this was so important. And during the Cold War era, it was the shortest parabolic route, and it was considered so important how the Arctic is looked at. So that's how the military schools have seen it. And once again, we see this kind of talks cropping up beyond cooperation to conflict is what I would say the Arctic is looking at. So, which is why the Arctic Council is even more important at this present moment. Russia, from 2022, it has also changed its policy from cooperation with Western-led institutions to self-reliance, economic exploitation, and also cooperation with the BRICS partners. So meanwhile, US is also looking at forced modernization. So the renewed attention on Greenland, we all have picked up the stories now. So that's also drawn sharp opposition from the NATO ally, Denmark, and also Greenland. So this is where we are at the moment. What we see now is the Western unity in the Arctic is showing signs of strain. The Arctic Council chairmanship is going to move from Norway to Denmark soon. So all eyes are now on that, how the Arctic Council is going to resume in a full-fledged manner. And of course, the indigenous people of Greenland are so important, and they are going to play a critical role in how Denmark is going to handle the Arctic Council chairship. So the tensions between US and Denmark over Greenland, the continued isolation of Russia, and US likely refusal to endorse any declaration that includes references to climate change all pose a significant challenge. Of course, US-Canada tariff war, Zelensky, Trump, I mean, I can go on and on. So this is how the Western unity looks at the moment. And overlaying all this is the growing role of non-Arctic states, particularly Asian powers, is critically viewed. While much of the Western narratives frame these states as resource-hungry opportunists, the perspective often shaped by what is called as polar Orientalism does not capture the full story. The non-Arctic states could pursue many other things in the Arctic, such as legitimacy, identity, shared goods, and inclusion in governance. So there's much more than what has been spoken commonly. They're party to the Polar Code, they're the party to the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. Even during post-2022, the Conference of Party was held in South Korea for the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. So, and track to diplomacy, of course, the Arctic Circle plays an important role, bringing all the non-Arctic players together, and there are sideline discussions that happen. So, but however, the Arctic Council always has had an approach to integrate but hedge the non-Arctic states. So this remains structurally excluded, and they have been always placed in the kids' table when is the Central Arctic Ocean Senior Arctic Official Meeting or being in the working group meetings. So we are unable to set agenda, initiate projects. So this is the challenge there. The Arctic once reflected bipolar tensions during the Cold War, defined by rivalry between US and South Soviet Union. Later, during the era of US, it's led to unipolarity. The Arctic Council functions smoothly then under the cooperative framework. But today, the global order is shifting towards multipolarity, and the global South is becoming more assertive, pushing for reforms in multilateral frameworks. So this could begin influence in the Arctic as well. So I would say the offensive realist approach could push towards new alignments and pursuing shared strategic interests in the region. So the Arctic geopolitical landscape is no longer insulated from broader realignments. So the pressing question that I would pose to this audience is the Arctic Council equipped to adapt to these new realities? Will the shifting order necessitate a reshape in Arctic governance? Given the scenario, is it time to move beyond the zero-sum logic and start to see the non-Arctic states, especially from the global South, not as a threat, but as an opportunity to reimagine Arctic governance in ways that are more inclusive, equitable, and reflective of the truly global perspective? So to conclude, I would say the Arctic is no longer a geopolitical exception. It is a reflection of global transformation. As the ice melts, so do the illusions of exceptionalism that once defined it. We now, in the Arctic, face three overlapping struggles: post-Cold War tensions between US and Russia, power shift from west to east, and the fractures within the Western alliance itself. If Arctic institutions fail to evolve, they risk being left behind, facing not only the end of exceptionalism, but perhaps the unraveling of the Arctic order itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Now, I also have to make a quick presentation and still hold the responsibility of keeping myself in check of the time. So, I'm originally from Ghana, but I've lived in Norway for 10 years now. And I'm looking at my role as an African living in the Arctic. And being here in New Delhi, listening to non-Arctic states' contribution, then it kind of breaks my mind, and I'm thinking, what can the African contribution be for the Arctic? So this is an exploratory talk in a relatively unexplored area. And I'm just going to give like a historical link from Africa to some Arctic states, and also project to see what could be the importance of having an African state within Arctic governance. So if you see on the screens, I would like, this is a picture of a Norwegian journalist, Erik Beyer, who visited a small community in Ghana in 1963. And the Norwegian government at that time was interested in getting to know the African states who have just acquired independence and to explore what kind of business and friendship relationship they can build with them. And they put a letter in what we call flaskepos. It's just a bottle, and threw it in the sea. It came to a community, and then the chief read it. He wrote to the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation, and then he was invited to Norway for 2 weeks in 1960. And when he was in Norway, he was sent to an Arctic city called Narvik. Narvik is one of the cities that experienced the Second World War. And when he came to Narvik, it was in snowstorm. And if you watch the video, and when he recounts his story, it doesn't only show his shock to what he saw, but he could also relate to some common challenges. And so, fast forward, the journalist also spent 2 weeks in his hometown and interviewed the chief and the community, trying to get to know this small coastal city. What kind of challenges do they have, and what kind of shared solutions can they proffer? And way back in 1963, it will shock you to know that some of the challenges that we talk about today, such as out-migration in the Arctic, creating jobs and keeping young people, these were some of the topics that they discussed way back in 1960. And so I'm asking myself, what happened after that? Well, it wasn't only friendship that drove some of the Arctic countries to Africa. This is a picture from Nigeria, also around the same time. And what you find in the picture is a picture of dried cod. In Nigeria, it's a delicacy to eat this dried fish. And this also helps the Arctic economy, so that between Norway and Iceland, the total fish, in terms of this dried fish exported to Nigeria, is about $120 million. So you can imagine the kind of business that goes on between this one particular kind of fish. But coming back into the modern era, from the 1960s, now we are in 2019. Here, it was in Tromsø, where about 24 UN ambassadors were invited to Tromsø by the Norwegian government. And it was to show them about Arctic. They were given a tour, the Arctic Ocean, and to experience climate change at first hand, and for them to also relate to the changes that was happening back in their home countries. And I happened to be at this program, and the UN ambassador of Ghana at that time, Ambassador Pobi, was there. And she really gave an interesting remarks about climate change affecting farmers, and it was something easy or similar to what we have heard this afternoon about the change in the monsoon and how it affects farmers planting and so on. And we had a conversation that what could be the solution of the apathy that we see from Africa. This is something I'll come back to. But another exploration I want to show you is you find 5 African leaders here. One of them is president, one is traditional leader, one is indigenous leader. They were sent to Svalbard, to the Global Seed Vault. And here, at that time, there was about 60,000 new seeds that were introduced in the Global Seed Vault. And these are all like illustrations of Arctic states' scientific diplomacy to non-Arctic states, especially in Africa, trying to bring Africa to the picture. So I have indicated the different changes. But then why is Africa not actively involved in the Arctic? Now there's talk about the fact that Africa is far away, and so there's really no relationship, or we can't actually establish any relationship. Well, is that true? We have heard how climate change in the north affect the south, and how whatever happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. So these are things that needs to be challenged and looked into. Well, there is also the obvious reasons why people say the financial constraints of African countries entering into polar research, especially in Arctic research. People say that if something is important to you, or you put your money where your mouth is, then how will African states be able to contribute to this? Well, the good news is things are beginning to change. This year, Ghana sworn in a new president, John Dramani Mahama. And for the first time in an inauguration speech, the president mentioned the Arctic. The president mentioned permafrost. These were words that were not known in the landscape. And for me as a Ghanaian listening to a president talking about the changes happening in the world and making reference to the Arctic, then it kind of pricked my mind that yes, maybe some people are beginning to think about all the things that are happening within change, climate change, food security being connected. But something also very obvious was that last November we saw snow in South Africa that blew everybody's mind. It left animals wondering where to take shelter. And so this happening is beginning to tie Africa and the Arctic together. But not only that, geopolitically, you would find that there was a Gabonese shipping tanker that sailed through Murmansk to China. So within the current geopolitical tensions, where you find that there is sanction on Russia, people say that this oil tanker belonged to Russia. Because Russia can't use it, then the Gabonese oil tanker had to flag it. So we're beginning to see even Africa drawn into these geopolitical happenings within our current Arctic governance. So what will happen if we have like a formal role for Arctic governance? I want to just finish in 1 minute. That yes, we have scientific institutions. In South Africa, we have the Antarctic Legacy Program, where South Africa, as one of the founding treaty members, had invested or still has like a station in Antarctic. And these are ways that we can kind of use this expertise in Arctic science and governance. So there's also an issue about new migration. I think this applies to India as well. In northern Canada, we are seeing professionals being imported in northern communities to work, and this is beginning to generate tension between indigenous peoples and newcomers. And it's the same with having non-Arctic professionals coming into Arctic and people within those communities feeling that they are being left out. So this new phenomenon is called the new migration. And I think that when we have research on these topics, we're able to relate and live well with Arctic communities. So navigating the future of the Arctic, I think that it's a very tough call, but we would hope that we would have African presence. What I'm saying is that Africa be the coolant of the geopolitical tension. We have African allies in terms of African working with Russia, with China, with India, at the same time working with the West, with their presence in the Arctic making a difference. And the question that I leave it to you is, as the world is moving to Africa in terms of new population growing up, will Africa also move to the Arctic? So I'm looking forward to questions to our dear panelists and also the discussion that follows later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry. A very interesting conversation, especially exploring the role of non-Arctic states. Speaking of non-Arctic states, since the morning I did not hear one name, China. Where do you stand on China? Especially because China has declared itself as a near-Arctic state, and definitely it has ambitions, it is already expanding its footprint. So where do you stand on China? Also, Chris, I love your soup.
Who are you? Me? Us? So China is presenting itself either as an entity not just like every other non-Arctic state, or alternatively, and in certain Western minds, definitely in security circles in the Western world, it's presenting itself as a Trojan horse using words like the global commons, using words like the Arctic being for everybody, expanding the notion of a near Arctic state to incorporate places that are hundreds, even thousands of kilometers away from the Arctic, and that's where the suspicions arise. The conversation, I think, has been perfectly identified, not by the security specialist, but by an Indian woman who is very important in terms of talking about subaltern communities. And perhaps everybody should know of Gayatri Spivak and her important contribution here. Among all of those in the non-Western world that might consider themselves to be subaltern, including the Chinese. It's an interesting indictment of academics, because even though she's certainly subaltern, she made her fortune, if you will, in New York City, at Columbia, in all the places that wouldn't be considered subaltern. However, in terms of geopolitics, the conversation has yet to be decided how open the Arctic should be. The Arctic Council claims it self-deputized itself to be the steward of the Arctic, and no other stewardship should be allowed. I think the global concerns and the sentiment, it's expressed generally here, is that that's a rather narrow, geopolitically circumscribed idea, and I don't think the circumpolar powers are going to let go of it. Consequently, for China, its entry is going to be difficult. By the way, the Chinese have not been very effective in promoting its policy in the Arctic. To the contrary, they have forestalled ventures. There's a lot of suspicion. They don't have that many friends, and they must necessarily depend upon the Russians, who have deep suspicions about the Chinese, particularly in the Far East, and certainly with regard to the Belt and Road Initiative going through the Central Asia, which is Russian territory, so say the Russians. So that's us. There you go.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, I want to thank all the panelists. It has been absolutely fascinating and thought-provoking interventions. There has always been a different understanding and interpretation of exceptionalism. In fact, some kind of a paradox has emerged before us, because I'm looking at the migratory birds, for example. I'm looking at the moment in the history of ecological modernization when we were deeply concerned about contaminated Arctic. The pollution was coming from the rest of the globe. Geopolitically, one can understand that Arctic exceptionalism stands challenged and perhaps even shattered. But ecologically speaking, I think the exceptionalism of the three poles remains in one form or the other. Now, because we are also talking about governance, I think one vision about the governance is democratization of that governance. We are looking at not only multipolar world order, we are also looking at multipolar polar order. Now, my question is to the panelists that what role do the emotions play? Because, for example, trust. I think one reference has already been made to suspicion. How important is trust? Because should Arctic states trust the non-Arctic states? Should non-Arctic states trust the Arctic states? How do we read into each other's motivations and narratives? So I thought I would just flag this point and request some interventions and responses. And just by the way, one example, Aurora Borealis, for example, which is conducted both by China and Japan in Iceland, seems to suggest has invited very different kind of reactions and responses, not only from Iceland, but from elsewhere as well. So trust, reactions, and governance, and inclusion.
I should just say very quickly, in terms of trust, if you look at the diplomatic correspondence that was leaked regarding what the Arctic Council said, you will see that there is not even trust, or there has not been trust at the level of the Arctic Council. It's the Arctic Five who are speaking secretly. Unfortunately, it was leaked by WikiLeaks, and if you read that correspondence, you will see that the Arctic Five do not trust the others, and they say that they should be excluded. So that creates something of a diplomatic kerfuffle, but I'll leave it to the diplomats to explain that.
Yes, just a short observation on your question, so that as is emerging also in the discussion in these 2 days, I think that so the non-Arctic countries can be very instrumental in keeping somehow the Arctic exceptionalism alive, because also for the Arctic countries it will be very difficult in the coming years and decades to keep this region working without the involvement of other partners, because we maybe the other partners share more this environmental concern, share more the idea that the Arctic is affecting the rest of the planet, and this is certainly the non-Arctic countries can be very helpful in at least to avoid the complete disappearance of this value idea of exceptionalism. So this is should be something that can be kept alive through the support of the world in general. So also, for example, if Africa will start also to pay attention to the Arctic, if the Asian country will share this cooperative idea, this of course will have a positive impact on the future. So this is something that maybe is quite clear in the conversation that we are having today.
No, just to endorse what has already been said, I would say that emotions are crucial, are extremely important, and that's why it's so difficult to predict developments, because some steps undertaken by certain leader go completely contrary to the logic, to the short-term or long-term aims of the countries they are leading. So we should also always take into account feelings, emotions, trust, or lack of it.
I think we are now out of time, but if we just finish in one, is there any comment? We can take one last comment. Yes.
Greetings, Excellencies. Actually, my question is very specific, and it is related that do you think that Arctic could eventually require a security regime like we have in Antarctica, as Article 1 of Antarctica Treaty, which says that there should be a demilitarization? So do we need any specific kind of military regime which prevents hard power escalation in Arctic?
You have a specific person, or you're just throwing it? Who would want to just take a 30 seconds on this question?
I think there's a developing security regime ongoing now, thanks to the Russians, and I think the real game is not in the Arctic. I think the real game is in the relationship between the Arctic and the Baltic. And so I think our Finnish colleague earlier today mentioned how the introduction of Finland, and certainly Poland's interests as well in the Baltic, combined with Sweden, and not to mention the Germans, and then you have Bornholm and the Danes. All of that is going on right to the port of St. Petersburg. And that's the security issue that will definitely complicate relationships in the Arctic. The Arctic is a Großraum. It is not simply above the polar circle. It is not simply relating to what the scientists say. It is not simply related to security issues that's defined by the military, which is what we've heard before. It is also an expanding geospatial world that brings in considerations all the way down to Poland and all the way up to Svalbard.
Yeah, I don't think we'll be able to create this kind of area in the Arctic, like military-free or mainly because of the political map of the world. In the Antarctic, we have like very clearly stipulated which area is like defined as the Antarctic, and in the north, this kind of area is covered simple by territories of the states. So that's, I think, one of the main reasons, and of course there are certain other reasons presented.
Yes, I agree with this evaluation also. In the 2 decades after the end of the Cold War, so this was not achieved. So the demilitarization was not wanted the United States at the time as well. So this is something that probably is not achievable, is not realistic. So we have to be realistic in approaching this Arctic security frame. But at the same time, it is also true that we have to shield the Arctic from the negative impact of geopolitics, and what is happening now, of course, is affecting the Arctic, and we have to work together to limit the consequences of the current situation, current evolution, which is quite is causing concerns, certainly.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that we would end it now. We've entered into like 8 minutes of your coffee break. So thank you very much for coming, and thanks very much to our panelists who have made the time to elaborate on this topic.